As I go to protocol, and here again I can hit use these settings, but as I go to protocol, this is again a panel that for Z-score training you wouldn't even have to touch. The only time that it would become important is if you decide to put additional secondary training variables into the protocol. You could put an additional stop on theta. You could put an additional go on low beta by simply selecting whatever component you'd like to add. Otherwise, they should simply all just be on ignore. Okay? And the one thing to keep in mind, in each one of these is an individual panel. Channel 1, Channel 2, Channel 3, and Channel 4, and I can put individual goes and stops on any component on any channel. Okay? When we get down and we look at global sustained reward criterion or refractory period, these are simply just fine-tuning parameters. Again, more than likely something you'll never even work with, never even adjust. Okay, they're at the factory defaults. The auto thresholding options, again, only used for traditional neurofeedback, not applicable for Z-score training. But you can set the auto set goes for % over time, the stops % over time. Notice the definition is always the same. We don't want to confuse you. So if we're putting in a stop, our goal is that 80% of the time it's meeting criteria, or meaning it's under threshold. So then only 20% of the time is it over the threshold, because that's not what we want. We want it to be under. Okay? Then we give you a separate stop for high beta. Okay? Auto thresholding for Z-score training, we want it off. Okay? Once we have it off, the threshold updating, not relevant. If it was on, we have manual. We have auto update once after the baseline. The most popular is the auto update repeat after the baseline and after each run. And then also available to you at any time is using the Y key on the keyboard to update those thresholds. Again, only when auto thresholding is on. For Z-score training, it's not applicable. Okay. The auto threshold epoch, again, only when it's selected on the on position, lets us decide how far back is the computer going to look at to decide what the threshold should be set on based on the client's performance. So it can look back 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 60 seconds. 60 seconds usually is the most common because it gives you a nice averaging number, so that if somebody has a sneeze or a cough or some kind of artifact related event, it's not going to dominate where that threshold goes. If I only have this set for 10 seconds and the person sneezed in that 10 seconds, the threshold's not going to be usable because it's going to be way off the screen. So keep that in mind. A longer time gives you a more usable average. Okay. As we go back up to the top again, we're on protocol. Our next step, we can look at display. Display is simply which panels would I like to see on my training screen. Now the good thing is a lot of these different options are all available live from the training screen. We don't have to make final decisions here. This is just if we know what we want, we can pre-select. Okay. Feedback. What type of sound do we want? Okay. Well, for instance, since this was a Z-score training, I'm going to have it on events. Okay. But let's talk about some of these sound options just so you're familiar with them. Reward sound is simply defined as dot wave when all criteria is met. Component sound is a dot wave for each component, meaning if you have multiple goes and multiple stops, when they all meet criteria, you're going to have multiple sounds. MIDI is very similar, where it's note for each component, but really the key here is remember that it's note for each go component with MIDI, because if it's a stop, it's a true inhibit under the MIDI option. That's something to really keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that with MIDI, there's other decisions to be made. We have to choose the voice, which is 1 out of 128 different possible sounds. Okay. A style is either a held note being sustained held note or percussive struck note, and you almost have to team this up with the type of instrument in question. For instance, if I go up to the top and I choose piano, piano tends to be a percussive instrument. The way I know that is if I go ahead and strike my finger down on the key and hold it there, after a few moments the sound is going to stop. Versus if it was an organ, it would be a sustained note. If I held the key down, the sound would continue to play. It's a neat little trick to determine whether these instruments are sustained or percussive, is just think of how they function that way. Okay? The modulation means if we meet criteria and the client stays above criteria, the higher they surge that above criteria, does it modulate based on volume? So it's basically soft to loud, or is it modulated on pitch and it's low to high? So you get that proportional pitch going up the scale or down. Okay, so keep that in mind. When we go to coherence and phase, this is the old traditional coherence and phase, not used very often anymore, because most of the time when people are doing coherence or phase training, they're using Z-score or database guided at this point. But we still do give you the option. There are still some people using traditional coherence and phase. Okay, so it is there. Simply, you're choosing coherence or phase, you're choosing it up or down, and then you're doing the same, making the MIDI decisions on voice, style, and modulation. Now you have another option that's complex, which gives you reward sound and MIDI notes. The other thing we give you now is you can also simply check them both. So you have multiple sound options if you choose. Okay? But for Z-score based training, S-Loretta based training, any of the newer protocols that are out there, ILF, you're looking at usually using the Event Wizard to define. Now the Event Wizard for the most part is very similar to the 3.0 software, and there are videos online explaining the Event Wizard in detail. So if you're going to do a lot of Event Wizard work, I really suggest looking at those videos. But the good thing is most of the protocols in question that you're going to use, they are already going to be pre-built in the Event Wizard, and you really won't have to make any changes there. The only thing you may look at is what sound you want to play and the MIDI properties within the Event Wizard more than any type of, you don't have to worry about any equations or any changing of the actual protocol. It's just simply the sounds that you would like to use. But this option literally is telling the system, look at the Event Wizard to determine what we want to hear for feedback. It's the most common that you're going to see with the newer protocols, especially the database driven protocols. Okay. Again, just in case I've made changes here, I want to hit use these settings, and it helps save it. The next section is an important one. This is your session control. The session control basically is asking us, do we want a baseline or not? How long is the session going to be? Within the session, will there be individual runs? Will there be pauses between runs? And then how many sessions might this client run eventually? So we have a lot of decisions to make here. So this is one of the most important screens. To start off, we look at baseline. I'm a big fan of baselines, so I like to change this this 0 to 30, and then realize that the 30 is seconds, and it's before and after. So keep that in mind. As we look over into run length, we see 120 seconds, so we assume that's a 2-minute run. But what exactly does run mean? Well, as we go down below that, we see for this particular session, number of runs is 10. So basically, if I take the number of runs times the run length, adding the pre and post baseline, I realize that this particular session for my client will be 21 minutes. Okay? 20 minutes training, which is the 10 runs, 10 2-minute runs. Okay? 30 seconds pre, 30 seconds post. That gives us a total of 21.